Welcome everybody. I am Colleen Miller, Manager of Coach Education and Development at Rowing Canada. And I'm very excited today to have Dr. Kim McQueen present for us today this webinar entitled How to Rig Nutrition to Support Your Immune Health. And so Kim will be speaking to our audience today, whether you're an active member, coach, athlete. Just to give a bit of background on Kim, who I know very well. Kim was a former coxswain for the Canadian national rowing team and has been a naturopath in Victoria practicing since 2001. She presently works with our national team athletes here in Victoria and many other elite athletes in and around Victoria, and has previously worked with Rugby Canada as well. I know she wants to do a whole webinar on her recent coxing experience at Head of Charles, which I was so lucky to be a part of, but we'll host that one in September, right, Kim?
Yeah, that'll be a full weekend.
That'll be a full weekend, and she's got some pictures behind her to share about that. We were just reminiscing there. Anyway, I'm going to hand it over to Kim right now. And but before we get started, this will be 45 minutes long, and it will be recorded, and it will be on our Rowing Canada website following on our COVID-19 page. For all the participants, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box, and we'll endeavor to answer as many as possible within that 45 minutes. So please go ahead, and Kim will, we will maybe answer them throughout. Kim will answer them throughout and then following. So I'm going to hand it over to Kim now, and thanks, Kim, for your time today and being here.
My pleasure. Thanks for asking me, and thanks for all those who have signed on. Yes, like Colleen said, like normally when I do an in-person talk or webinar, I guess a webinar is not in person, but when I give a talk, I do like it to be interactive. So let's see how the questions go, and I'll try to handle them throughout. But then if we're getting slowed down, then I may just moving them towards the end. Most important to me is that you come out knowing more than you did before we connected. And so I've tried to set this up to be helpful. And so therefore the questions, if you have them, please bring them forward. What I wanted to do was cover an overview of some of the concepts in immune health and where current thinking is at as it applies mostly to athletes and active people, and then go into some of the nutrition components that have kind of percolated to top or being most impactful to athletes or active people. And so certainly it's not going to be an exhaustive overview of the immune system or nutrition, but hopefully it'll give you some highlights that you can be thinking of or mindful of as you move into the fall and winter. And I guess in the circumstances we're at. So when we talk about the immune system, we talk about two main branches of the immune system. One is called the innate immune system, and the other is called the acquired. And the innate can also be considered the non-specific or your first line of defense. Where the acquired is more thought of as a specific component of the immune system, or I guess a deeper level or a deeper dive, and more of a backup to the innate system. But really, when you get into the immune system, it is quite complex and has many cells, many chemical messengers, communication. And I can't resist these kinds of similes or comparisons. So much like when we row, and especially in a crew boat, and as it goes into a bigger size, we need to have coordinated efforts and communication. And certainly the immune system doesn't really have a switchboard like the old telephone systems, but there's lots of communication between the different components of the immune system and the different cell types. And it's actually pretty miraculous, I think, that the whole thing, how it works. So when we look at these branches of the innate and the acquired, or adapted or specific parts of the immune system on the right-hand side of the slide. I just wanted to, this is a great paper that was put out by Gatorade Sports Sciences by Neil Walsh in 2019. So you can look it up and it would give you a nice overview of some of the things we're going to talk about in our time today. But when you look at this figure, which is simplified, when we look at the innate, which again, as I said, is your first line of defense and your second line of defense, the first thing we have are your intact barriers. So basically that's your skin. Obviously, if you get a cut, then the barrier is not intact anymore. And then we have other points of contact, which would be the mucous membranes, which are your eyes, your respiratory tract, which starts in the mouth, and then I guess the mouth and the nose in terms of digestion, and then points of contact as you go down the respiratory tract and into the digestive tract. And I think in my area of work, especially as a naturopath, but the mucous membranes are a huge area of interest to me. And the health of the mucosa is very important. And in some ways, I think when there's not so much in a cold, but when there's respiratory distress, that's more of a chronic picture. I think a lot of times it reflects where the digestive health is at, which is another mucous membrane. One thing to point out is that the mucosa has its own kind of immune elements to it. And as an example, when there's irritation along the mucosa, whether it be from exposure to an allergen or exposure to a virus or a bacteria, or digestively, the body produces mucus. And so we can all have had experience with that, the body is uptaking its mucus production to help try to flush or get rid of this irritant. So that's like an example of the very first line of defense, which is are your barriers. As you move further into the innate system, as this example has neutrophils and monocytes, these are types of white blood cells, but there are many types of white blood cells. And you can see that as things get past the barrier and into the second line of defense, then we start to have the innate system, which is doing surveillance, responding to foreign items and foreign matter and foreign cells to determine whether it needs to go into a bigger or a deeper immune response. And so, as you can see, the monocyte is deciding that this antigen is problematic or worth deeper consideration, and passes it off to the specific parts of the immune system, which is the acquired or the third line of defense. So when we look at the acquired or the specific immune system, you could think of it more like if you have allergies, then that's the acquired part of your immune system that has evolved, and it is deemed the pollens or the grasses or what have you as a threat to your system and starting to mount an antibody or immune response to it. And when we respond to viruses or bacteria, a lot of times it moves more into a deeper acquired part of your immune response, and kind of more is going on in terms of the types of cells that are produced and the inflammation and the messengers. So you can see in this picture, when someone's exposed to a pathogen, there's in that green kind of bubble, there's initial response from the innate immunity. You can kind of think of that as the acute response. So cells are coming in and looking at the pathogen, and actually it's super cool, like the macrophages and some of these cells, they will actually engulf the pathogen and take it up within itself and start to digest it, and then put it out to its surface, and it will go into other parts of the immune system in a term that's called antigen presenting. So these macrophages will present the foreign matter to the innate immunity and say, is this a problem or is this not a problem? Do we need to respond? And do we need to heighten our response? And so in the case where there is a heightened response, you can see that the adaptive immunity is triggered, and the body starts to produce, say, the B cells, they produce antibodies, which goes back and goes to find the pathogen and lock onto the pathogen and destroy it. So it's, I think, a really remarkable system that is happening all the time in our body. So this is a diagram of the lymphatic system. And so the lymphatics they're part of the immune system, and they're vessels that run all throughout the body, just like we have blood vessels. And in a sense, they and the blood are carrying the immune cells and the immune components. But I think of the lymphatics as not like providing suction, but being like a vacuum to remove debris and unwanteds and the crud and the immune response out of the cells and into the lymphatic system. And then it moves through the lymphatics towards lymph nodes and lymphatic tissue. And so the lymphatics, they run all through the arms, through the legs, through the head and neck, and actually everything drains towards the heart, because around the middle of the chest is where the lymphatic fluid re-enters the bloodstream and recirculates all the time. So an interesting thing about the lymphatics too is that these vessels, unlike the arteries of the blood vessels, they are not muscular in nature. So they're kind of embedded through our muscles. So when we move and we're active, then that helps pump the lymphatic fluid up against gravity for its circulation. So that's why, say, in airplane travel, you can get some congestion in your legs because you're not up and moving as well as obviously the pressure change in the airplanes. And you can see there's lymph nodes along the chain of the lymphatics. And also there's different lymphatic organs, like say the tonsils or the thymus or the spleen. And so in the case of the tonsils, there's actually 4 sets of tonsils. So one set is at the entrance of the mouth and just past the palatine arch. So when people get tonsillitis or strep throat repeatedly, it's that set of tonsils that sometimes don't calm down. And so an approach has been to remove the tonsils. And the other 3 sets are more at the back of the throat and the back of the nose. So they're also trying to capture immune activity at, again, that barrier or entry point of if something's coming into the system. And so as things flow through the lymphatic system and the lymphatic tissue, I really like this little picture. I think of it as when the lymphatics goes through the lymph nodes, that the lymph nodes are kind of like a police station. So there's a lineup of the different cells and the different foreign matter that has been taken up. And the immune system needs to make a decision. Do we need to react or don't we? And actually, in some cases of virus and bacteria, they've evolved to try to evade the human immune system. And so essentially this lineup is moving through the lymphatic system and through the lymph nodes, and the body has to make a decision like which one of these doesn't belong. And I think that's really poignant because when you think of the fact that, which is deeper into the slides, we don't react to the good bacteria that are living along the digestive tract, or in the case of what is considered autoimmunity, this is where the system has decided, it's said that your body's attacking itself. I suspect we still just don't fully understand those disease processes yet. Or in the case of an allergy, like I said before, the body has perceived that pollen as a threat to the system and mounted an antibody response to it, when in fact we know it's not a threat. So there are times or places where there, I guess, perhaps is some dysfunction within the immune system. So when you are surveying symptoms, or if you see a practitioner or a medical doctor who palpates lymph nodes, so kind of along the jawline or along the neck, kind of, we know how lymphatic should flow. But the idea is to see if it's palpable, if there's a palpable congestion. And those could be signs that there's, heightened immune activity. Or when you think of the case of spleen enlargement for mono, that's because the body is responding to the Epstein-Barr virus, and so the spleen is enlarging from the burden or the demand. I think I'm mostly going to be focusing today on the respiratory tract and the idea of upper respiratory tract infections. And I suppose in rowing or in sport, one aspect of the respiratory tract that is extra important is that, you know, the more well we can stay, and this is probably true for life in general, then obviously the more we can get out of it, or with an athletic lifestyle, the more you can get out of your sessions and training and show up more often, versus when people are getting run down and sick more often or sick before competition, then obviously that's going to counter where the goals lie. And so there are obviously lots of other elements of the immunity that is of great interest in sport. I would say asthma, allergies, digestive health, inflammation, and recovery from the stimulus of training. But we're going to mostly focus on appearance at the respiratory tract. So when we look at the respiratory system, and most people probably are aware of this kind of rule of thumb, but I thought it would be you know, good to include, would be that when symptoms of cold are above the neck, then we generally consider that one could still train. And when symptoms start to deepen further or below the neck into the respiratory tract, or they include vomiting or diarrhea or fever, then that's where people should reconsider and more focus on rest. Obviously, you have to read the situation and read how it's progressing and the context. Like, is this someone that gets sick all the time, or has other conditions to consider, or is it a fairly mild situation? So yeah, that's a great question, Alexander. So what questions do I mean when the symptoms are above the neck? So to me, I would think sore throat, runny nose, sneezing, maybe sinus congestion, depending on how bad it is. So just, I kind of pointed here that we have a maxillary sinus here, and then there's also a frontal sinus up here. So sometimes sinus troubles will show up here or here. Those would be the main symptoms I would be thinking of, versus heavy coughing or congestion or shortness of breath or the lungs aching. Hopefully that's good. Just looking here to see if there's anything else I want to talk about. Okay. So another concept to kind of segue a little bit in that's fairly new in considering immunity for athletic populations is this idea of resistance and tolerance. And I suppose this was started to be presented just last year in 2019. So the traditional view of how we apply an immune approach to athletes would consider a bunch of variables, but a big one, which I'm sure I probably have said as well, and others on the call would be thinking of, is that there's a down regulation of the innate and the acquired immunity after high intensity exercise. So a lot of research has been directed towards how can we mitigate an athlete getting sick in that window of exposure or opportunity. And this is kind of part of that resistance of the immune system, and how can we keep the strength of the immune system so that, especially when it downregulates, the athlete isn't at risk of picking something up. But what the more recent findings have been, even like from the mid 2000s, or I should say like 2015, 2016, 2018, was that when they followed athletes, there wasn't really a rise in upper respiratory tract infections that were happening right in that window. So even though that there's this recognizable down regulation in the acquired or the innate immunity, or in both of them, then it's not really exposing the athlete in a way that we were thinking. And so the focus has started to shift to, I would think of it as a balance between two considerations in immune health. So one is the resistance, or this, like I say, the strength of the immune system, and the other is the tolerance. So the ability to respond to in a balanced manner to exposures. So whether they be a virus or a bacteria, or like I said, I do think of allergens in this way too, that the immune system doesn't overreact, and or we limit the severity or the number of days of the infection. And so that's the idea of building tolerance in athletes. And so the pendulum in science is swinging a little bit for the research to be focused on how do we build tolerance in athletes. I, in fact, think that the two don't need to be mutually exclusive, and that it's really both should be on the table for consideration. It's just that I don't think we need to look at that window of exposure, that open window they call it, right after high intensity activity, that's the time that the athlete is getting sick. It's more a landscape view of how are they doing in terms of these two features. So in fact, when we consider athletes, I've kind of, the research goes all the way up to high performance sport, but you could back this down to recreational athletes, that the risk factors are really similar to what we would consider for the general population. So in terms of risk of picking up a upper respiratory tract infection, which would be a cold, would be cold and flu season, the stress, anxiety and depression. So the mental emotional health is really heavy there in terms of being a risk factor, poor sleep quality, and travel. And so when I think of items like stress or anxiety and depression and poor sleep, in terms of this idea of resistance and tolerance, it makes me think of a concept that I think some of my practice is rooted in, and this is the idea of the building robustness. And I often have defined health as being a balance between the burdens on your body and your body's ability to cope. And that when you think of a bucket, the more empty the bucket is, or the more drained the system is, then the easier it is to knock it off keel. So I think when I'm doing a survey or an intake on an athlete or a patient, or looking at a circumstance, first of all, I think we are all individuals. So we all present kind of a uniqueness of our circumstances and of our genetics and of our, even maybe our nutritional mix and makeup. And so for me, it's a bit of a survey of, with the red arrow, we have all the things that work on kind of building robustness and filling our bucket up, or making deposits into the account. And the blue is more the things that maybe drain our system, or the demands on our system. And the more we can have robustness there, then I think it's easier to cope, even in terms of stressors. I think it's easier to have good quality sleep. So sometimes an athlete's sleep or a person's sleep can be drained by a transient stressor, like a hard training day or something in life that stressed them. But if it moves along and they regain sleep quality, that's good. But if it's persistent, then I think there's a drain in the system, either a burden or not enough coping. And so that's where I think it's really great to have this concept of building robustness into health, which takes into consideration nutrition and lifestyle habits and mental emotional health. And the more robust we can make it, the harder it'll be to knock it off keel. I'm just going to check here on a question. Hi, Bruce. Pre-competition taper. Yeah, that's interesting, Bruce. So anecdotally, I don't know if everyone can see the question. It seems that athletes are more vulnerable during a pre-competition taper. Is there science behind this? I believe that yes, there is. There is some good, I think the paper is Drew. I could always make it available. The author is Drew et al., which I believe is 2018, but it might be 2016. And he followed athletes, say, through an Olympic cycle. So I was thinking about this. Actually, I went for a run this morning, and I was thinking about all these nuances, and that when you think of resistance and tolerances, as well as that, in a way, in some aspects, like moderate intensity exercise actually heightens the immune system, or athletes are thought to actually have quite strong immune systems rather than this weakened state if they're well nourished. And that when we kind of maybe take the pedal off the metal, or like when we go into vacation mode and people then get sick, I've kind of was thinking of these factors in terms of how an athlete approaches competition. And so in fact, with the nutrition approaches I'm going to present today, I would suggest that these would be considerations that actually would help in the phase before competition, and or around travel, and or around stress or changed circumstances, like when an athlete, say for us, leaves the training center to go home for the holidays or something like that, where they're going to be around other people. I hope that helps. So we're going to move, I'm just going to do a time check, see how we're doing here. This is great. So as we segue towards nutrition, the foods that we eat are coming from three main nutrient categories. So I always like to do a little reminder of this. And so we call these the macronutrients, macro meaning big. So these are the nutrients that hold bigger places in our needs. And micronutrients refers to the vitamins and minerals, and micro means small, and so we need less of them. And so the three main macronutrient categories are carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. And so I generally think of the carbohydrates as coming from grains, vegetables, and fruits. And of course, you can have overlap across what a food delivers. And so in the case of grains, and those beans are an example of legumes, which is a fancy word for beans and lentils, they can give you carbohydrate and protein. When we look at protein, we mostly think of meat, fish, nuts and seeds, eggs, cheese, yogurt. I think I got everything. Nuts and seeds can be as nut and seed butter. So those are driving our protein grams. And then the third categories are the fats that we eat. And many times the fats are added, we've added it to the food, or if it's a packaged good, the company's added it to the food, or it's found within the proteins, generally speaking. And in fact, if we think of building robustness, being appropriate in the intake of all the macronutrients is very important. So they're all fueling different aspects of health. And even I'm going to focus on the protein today because that's where the research is at. But even if we think of the fats, the omega-3 fatty acids, they can modify inflammation, which is a component of the immune response to a cold or flu, or to inflammation to do with asthma or allergies or sinusitis or digestive health. So the fats that we eat can either heighten inflammation or dampen it. So every macronutrient category is important. And in fact, another element that as kind of near and dear to my heart is the idea of low energy availability or relative energy deficiency in sport, and which is a little bit controversial in terms of how it backs into immune health with different camps. And I would say that the more the intake matches the demands, then the better the robustness would be, and the better the micronutrient and macronutrient status would be to limit the burden. And I think you could even consider training as being a stressor on the system, and that the body has to respond and adapt. So the more well-matched they are, the better. And so that when an athlete or a person, and I think this is actually quite common in the general population, is in low energy availability, their nutrition is not matching their demand, I think that's where you can have some trouble start to show up. It's just whether it's shown up in the research yet. And I think that's where I focus today's talk on what is showing up in the research specifically, rather than clinically as I experience it. Just trying to think if there's something else I wanted to say about low energy availability. Yes, and the other thing I think about low energy availability is if the nutrition intake is matched for calories, but not for nutrients. So you can have food that's calorie dense, but not nutrient dense. Then I also think those are areas of exposure. So these are the 4 nutrient interventions that stand the test of time for some of them, but also are topical and I guess accepted. They have a high degree of research behind them. So they would be backed as evidence-based. And this would be using vitamin C, vitamin D, probiotics, and protein. So of all the macronutrients, having optimal protein or adequate protein intake is helpful. So we're gonna run through each of these. So we look at vitamin C. I've given you some pictures of some foods that are rich in vitamin C. So vitamin C, I suppose first and foremost, is considered an antioxidant. And when I was saying that there's a cascade of reaction that happens in the immune system and even in the innate part where I said the cool macrophages engulf this foreign matter and start to digest it and destroy it so that it can present it to the immune system and say, like, is this a problem or not? This is what I found. That when that process is happening, it actually, the macrophage produces what are called reactive oxygen species, which are just compounds that are somewhat damaging to tissue. And actually, in fact, exercise creates oxidative damage. And then what we want and the immune system to do is to come in the case of exercise, and heal up that damage and adapt and evolve the athlete, depending on what your goals are. And so vitamin C is an antioxidant, and there actually are many nutrients that are antioxidants, but vitamin C's got lots of data on it as being helpful to the respiratory tract, for decreasing the incidence of upper respiratory tract infection and also shortening the duration. I also use it sometimes with athletes with asthma and or allergy, because other cells of the immune system called mast cells, which are the cells that release histamine in an allergic reaction, taking vitamin C and another bioflavonoid called quercetin can help stabilize the mast cells so they don't rupture so easily. So vitamin C has a place in helping modulate or build that tolerability or tolerance of the immune system, and maybe dampen, say, allergic reaction or asthmatic reactions. The tricky part in sport is that we want some of the oxidative challenge, especially in high performance sport. But maybe if an athlete is more not interested in pushing the envelope on the adaptation, then one would use vitamin C a little more liberally than we might in a high performance environment. So it's just being purposeful about what we're looking for. But the dosing range is about, for the research, is about 200 to 1,000 milligrams per day. One thing about vitamin C is it's a water soluble vitamin. So most of the vitamins actually are water soluble and some are fat soluble. So vitamin A, D, E, and K are fat soluble. And when something's water soluble, it tends to be less risky, so your body will take what it needs and eliminate the rest. Whereas if something's fat soluble, you have the ability to kind of store it up. And so then maybe you have to be more careful in terms of your dosing and where someone's levels are at, because you don't want to overload them. Where with vitamin C, it's a fairly safe vitamin to take, and you just need to be purposeful of what you're looking to do. And when it's water soluble, if I was doing an intervention with a person, I would be more thinking about trying to keep their vitamin C levels up through the day. So either, say for instance, if it was going to be a 1,000 milligram dose, then buying a time released format, or pulsing it in through the day, like getting a 250 without being too high maintenance, and saying, can you take that 4 times a day? And it's well tolerated in terms of taking it without food. Some other considerations would be, though, is that actually if someone has a active upper respiratory tract infection or need, you can actually go well above that dose of 1,000 milligrams. And what I would sometimes do is build it to what's called bowel tolerance. So if someone gets too much of it, it'll eventually show up as diarrhea. So you could keep building the dose, and until you hit that point, the body's using it up. A couple other factors to be aware of is, so vitamin C is called ascorbic acid, so it is acidic in nature. So sometimes people will use those NRCs or emergencies or put vitamin C into a drink and drink it back. And dentists don't love that because then you've got acid on your teeth. So it's just being aware of that. And then for some people, it can upset their, I said it's well tolerated, but it can feel upsetting to people who have too much acidity in their stomach. And in that case, a more gentle form is called calcium ascorbate. So they've bound this ascorbate to calcium, which is alkalinizing, so that it neutralizes the acidity. Let me just see this question. So that's a piece about vitamin C. Do you recommend increase vitamin C at the outset? Yes, I do recommend an increase in vitamin C at the outset of cold. So I think probably answered that as it came in, but I would definitely build up vitamin C, even if someone started to feel like, geez, am I fighting something? I'm a real advocate of also being mindful. Obviously, we are more mindful these days, but being mindful of your interactions. So if I know that I'm seeing patients and I'm starting to see sickness coming up, so if I have a day of work and there's a sick person after a sick person, I might start taking vitamin C just for the fact that I know my exposure has been higher. Or if my kids were going back into the school system, then some of these interventions like vitamin C, and we're going to talk about probiotics, I would put them in preceding the start of that transitional time, or you could precede cold and flu season when you're not worried about the high performance adaptation piece. And like I said, you could precede travel with taking it. You could precede competition like by 4 weeks with vitamin C as an intervention. This next one is vitamin D. And vitamin D has an ability to help regulate the innate immune response. And it also has an anti-inflammatory impact. So when we think about that inflammatory response of the immune system, it can help with some of that tolerability of response to bacteria or virus. And I am a huge proponent of testing people for vitamin D status. So you can test the blood level for a serum is just another word or another component of blood, but it's called 25 hydroxy vitamin D. And I look to have levels over 100, but even like, I mean, I look really for 110, but if someone's over 100, I'm not so worried about it. And the bottom end of the norm range that still might suggest deficiency is 75. And where Health Canada especially might recommend 400 to 800 international units, but accept 1,000 international units, dosing ranges tend to be more like 1,000 to 4,000 or 1,000 to 5,000 international units per day. And so I think it's really important to know where an individual's status is. So there's plenty of research on vitamin D for robustness, immune health, even against cancers, responding to inflammation and infection, and also mental emotional health. So I wanted to take a little bit of a deeper dive on vitamin D because most people do know about it, but just making sure we all understand. So one way to get vitamin D is through exposure of the skin to UVB radiation. And the UVB rays convert, interestingly, a form of cholesterol into pre-vitamin D3. And when I do nutrition talks, oftentimes I have to say cholesterol isn't all bad. And in fact, the sex hormones, estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone are made from cholesterol. So cholesterol in the skin surface is converted into a pre-vitamin. So that's one route of building someone's vitamin D levels. And or ingesting it in the way of food or through supplementation. And also more recently, I've been looking at vitamin D creams came across my path as treatments for psoriasis as a consideration, which is a condition that responds to UV treatment, like light treatment. So I think it's kind of an interesting route of absorption. And one thing I find that even in athletes at the training center who are out on the water, previously 2 to 3 times a day, depending on how someone's covered up, or I believe that in our northern latitude, there's not as much as the UVB rays. The time of the year will impact as well. We'll still find athletes that are low on vitamin D status, and I see it a ton in my clinic. I often share that even I, years ago, was a new mom with 3 children, and I would be out at parks. I don't really wear sunscreen unless I'm somewhere closer to the equator or out for a very long time. And I was taking 3,000 international units, and when I tested my blood, I was still low. So for me, it's really important to see where someone is at, consider their context, like are they at that number and they have been supplementing, or they have been sun exposed or not. And then in an ideal world, I would test someone at springtime when they're coming out of the fall winter, and then testing them again at the end of the summer when they're coming out of the summer, to start really getting an individualized read on where their levels are at. So things that would impact where you think I'm outside and I'm getting the sun exposure would be if there's less sun. Like I said, the more northern latitudes, you're using sunscreen, you're using cover up. Darker skin has more pigment in it, so the UV rays can't get through as easily. Carrying more weight, interestingly, the research shows that it tends to have people have lower vitamin D status and not really sure the cause or the circumstances. If someone has low cholesterol, then they don't really have as much of the backbone to do the conversion. Also, food sources for vitamin D are fairly limited. It is a fat-soluble vitamin, which again is why I believe people should be tested. I do think in BC, a lot of times I hear people say that they were told, don't test, just take it. But I've seen lots of people taking it and they're still not where they need to be. So doing the testing helps you figure out what's the appropriate dose. And also because it's a fat-soluble vitamin, you can build it up in your system, and it's one that can create toxicity. And I actually had a patient who came to me as a new patient, and instead of taking 1 drop a day for 1,000 IUs, she was taking a dropper full, which probably would be like 30 drops a day. So, and we did find that she was too high. So I think it's an important thing to be informed about, even if you have to pay for it. In BC, whether I order it or the lab charges someone, it is about $100. So the testing options for that, I think, it's a blood draw. So you do have to have the lab ordered by a medical doctor or a naturopath. Like I said, a lot of times in Western medicine, a patient might be told they still need to pay for it. But I think that's a reasonable thing to consider paying for, because I do think it gives you good information. And then it's just remembering that seasonality and the consideration of your context of how you went into the lab test. So what I was going to say about the food sources is because it's fat soluble, it's usually in the fatty components of some foods. So sources that are high in vitamin D would be fatty fish, where like a 3-ounce or a deck of card size serving could give about 400 international units. Other sources would be egg yolk could give 40 international units. Whole fat dairy could have some vitamin D in it. Fortified food could have some vitamin D in it. Liver could have some vitamin D in it, and also kidneys. So there's conversion of vitamin D through this picture at the liver, and it moves through the kidneys. And so I was thinking too of the wisdom of eating like steak and kidney pie or liver, which I don't personally eat, but if you want to, you can heighten your food sources without supplementation. But lots of times the dosing ranges need to be higher, I think, than the food sources could provide. And also the wisdom I was thinking too of the cod liver oil, right? How are we doing? Okay, I'm gonna move quicker. So this wonderful picture is supposed to represent the digestive tract and the microvilli that line the tube of the digestive tract, and the microbiome or the microbes that live along the surface. And so the digestive tract starts at the mouth, goes all through the body as the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, the large intestine, and the exit. The whole thing is a mucous membrane. It's colonized by microbes the whole way along. Some have said that there's more microbes living on or in the body than there are cells. And as a lot of people probably are aware, this is a huge area of interest for research. I like to joke that I learned about it in 1997. But anyways, the probiotics, or the good bacteria, and one strain is acidophilus, if you've heard those words, they help us digest food. They produce vitamins, and through competition or competitiveness, they help to keep the bad guys or the unwanteds down. And the foods we eat actually also do impact the microbial environment. And so also being athletic, the more active someone is, the more diverse the microbial population would be. So when probiotics have been supplemented, there's been reduced incidence and severity of upper respiratory tract infection. Probiotics are generally well tolerated. They should be well tolerated, I should say, meaning that when you take it, someone should not get diarrhea or constipation or more gas, like possibly more gas for a first couple of days, but it should settle out. And I kind of use the joke that it would be like putting a new worker into an office space and everyone kind of needs to adjust a little bit, but really they should be well tolerated. There's another phenomenon in immune health and digestive health called intestinal permeability. This is very common in human health, and it's actually a consequence of high intensity exercise, which means that the cells of the digestive tract become a bit inflamed, and they become, between the cell spaces, a bit permeable to what's in the digestive tract. So it could be the byproducts of microbes, or it could be foods, and that's where I believe that food sensitivities and allergies can start to develop. And probiotics can reduce that intestinal permeability. Salivary IgA, I didn't really talk about it. I mentioned that the mucosa has some components of its own immunity, and IgA stands for immunoglobulin, which is another word for antibody. So it's one type of antibody, and probiotics help increase that, element of the immune system along the mucosa, which is a benefit. So it's a huge area of research. Normally the dosing is talked about as billions of bugs. And so the dosing range tends to be 10,000 to 50,000 bugs per dose, not to gross anybody out. And so usually they come in a capsule form or can be a powder. I often might recommend one called BioK, which are these little yogurts that in the container is 50 billion bugs. And so depending on how aggressive I am going to be, I might suggest someone takes half the container, which is 25 billion bugs, because they're fairly expensive, so it'll make it last. If I want to be more aggressive, I might at least do a few days at 50 billion and see how someone responds. I like the BioK because they're more food-like and lots of people respond well to them. I do think with probiotics, there is a difference from one to the other in terms of, I suppose, quality or how it impacts people. But the research is strong that just generally the probiotics are beneficial. If you're working with athletes that are subject to testing for banned substances, in Canada, there's a company which most people know about called Clean Athlete, with a K, K-L-E-A-N, and it's produced by Douglas Labs. And basically the product line or the SKUs they have are tested to be free of banned substances, and they do have a probiotic in their lineup. They do not have a vitamin C. There's a company in the US called Thorne that would test some of their vitamin C, but they have discontinued that, much to my sadness. So the last category of nutrients, which should be fairly helpful or easy for people, is the protein. So we talked a little bit about the food sources, and many components of the immune system are made from proteins, or the amino acids, which are the building blocks of protein. So antibodies that our bodies make are protein in nature. the cytokines, which are some of the chemical messengers during that communication process of the immune system, and the acute phase proteins, which are again components of the immune system. If anyone's ever had lab tests for C-reactive protein, that's a non-specific marker of inflammation. So as a part of the innate response to inflammation, and we can test that in the blood. Ferritin and transferrin, which are involved in iron regulation, are acute phase proteins. And so actually, I did want to kind of sneak this in, that when you're testing an athlete for iron status, to me, it's really important to test the iron in the bloodstream, which will test the transferrin, but also the ferritin, which is the iron stores. Some practitioners or some people only look at their ferritin status, but it can be falsely elevated by inflammation, at which, as we've learned, if we didn't already, inflammation can be a consequence of allergies, training, digestive troubles, sinus troubles, or what have you. So the ferritin could look good, but it's a false elevation. So I like to kind of look at a bigger landscape view of the status. So the target for protein intake is 1.2 to 2 grams per body weight. If it's an active person, I usually start, this is from the research, 1.2 to 2. I usually start more like 1.6 grams per kilogram and push up towards 2 grams per kilogram the more active someone is. When I worked with Rugby Canada with the men's program, we were up at 3 and 3.5 grams per kilogram. And so if you consider protein as one of the macronutrients, the more the caloric intake goes up, you kind of do have to like build it with everything. So I think that is just a reminder of where the macronutrients are coming from. And with the protein, it's great to get your number and then pulse it through the day. And huge, huge key in human health and athletic and sporting life is to be consistent. So the more consistent you are, I think the better the outcome. So I know we went a little bit over time. There's a little summary slide with some of the dosing ranges summarized. And I'm happy to stick around. It's 12:55 for a few minutes if people have further questions. And thank you for listening, and I really hope you have found it helpful.
Hi, Kim. I think there's one question there from Christian.
Yeah. Move it over. Questions. Considering that there is an individual basis on supplemented vitamin D absorption. I don't know if can everyone see them, or should I read it out?
I think they can see them now.
Okay. Considering there is an individual-based response to supplemental vitamin D absorption, will this require pairing vitamin D with another supplement to facilitate absorption? Also, given that vitamin D is fat soluble, is there a reason to consider that an athlete can store vitamin D and rely less on supplementation? They may utilize their stores. Thank you very much for your presentation. Oh, you're very welcome. Second question, no, I wouldn't make assumptions about athletes being able to store it differently. And the first part of the question, some would argue that it's good to take vitamin D with foods that have fat in them to help absorption. And I didn't really point this out on the slide about the vitamin D pathway, which I could flip to here, I think. Whoopsie, I exited the view. Do you see the whole thing yet? No. Let me just see here. Technology, right? Is that to absorb vitamin D, it'll basically go down, if you swallow a supplement, it'll go down the digestive tract, and it'll go down the digestive tract through the stomach, and then when it enters the small intestine, bile is, when you eat fatty food, or actually when you eat, the gallbladder contracts, and what the gallbladder does is it stores or concentrates bile, which is made by the liver. The richer the food, the more bile will be ejected from the gallbladder to kind of meet the meal's needs. And when you need to absorb something fat, the bile salts within the bile have to bind the fat to help absorb it into the system, to emulsify it. And so I think it could be arguable that to put vitamin D supplementation in with a richer meal, or not richer meal, but a meal that has fats in it, then you'll get more bile release, which may heighten your ability to absorb it. I don't think that's a factor for everyone. I think I would consider that if it was someone who I know they were having a good amount of supplementation, but their serum levels aren't rising with the supplement choice. And I think it's noted on here, if people have had their gallbladder removed, then what happens is the bile is just slowly trickling into the digestive tract without that ability to upregulate. So there would be concerns and considerations on whether someone's able to absorb the vitamin D that they're taking in through supplementation. And that's that idea too of putting it in, whether the skin is a good route of putting it in to be absorbed into the system, which I think could be valid because we give progesterone, which is also, as I said, made from cholesterol, topically to be absorbed into the system for systemic circulation.
Okay, Kim, that's great. Can you do one last question here from Lori?
Lori?
And then
Yeah,
we'll
you
wrap
bet.
up.
That's a great question, Lori. It's like another favorite of mine is that, so when you have, sometimes it's about reading food labels and looking some things up just for a brief period of time so you can kind of get an idea of where your protein intake is at. And then you could do a calculation of your kilogram body mass times the 1.6 to see where the target is and how well matched you are. And that's that thing about being consistent. The more consistent you are at hitting that target, the better. Whereas if you have a day where you hit 100 grams, but the next day you're down at 50, then you're still in a deficit relative to where the research is at. When you look at meat or fish, when it's the size of a deck of cards or it's a 3-ounce serving, that gives about 20 grams of protein. So if you've got a 3-ounce steak, that's going to give you about 20 grams of protein. Once I saw a 20-ounce steak in Hawaii at an Ironman, and it was huge, and you could do the math on that one. So mostly the 3-ounce serving is what you go off, 20 grams. An egg is about 6 or 7 grams, so you need about 3 to get to a deck of cards. And Greek yogurt, 3/4 of a cup is about 20 grams. Cheese, you'd have to look at that. I don't really actually have that top of mind. I would think it's about 10 grams for what would be considered an ounce. So hopefully those are kind of some good, benchmarks for you.
A lot of protein. Good.
You got to eat that.
Okay.
Or just have a 20-ounce steak once a day. No, don't do that.
Yeah, or right before an Ironman.
Yeah, totally.
Okay, thanks so much, Kim. That was an amazing presentation with a lot of really great information. I know Kim delivered a nutrition session a while back in the spring, so this builds on that. And I think there's a lot of takeaways for everybody, athlete, coach, part-time athlete. And really appreciate your time to do this, Kim. I know it's another thing in your day to ask, but all of our members are really grateful, and we certainly are too. It goes a long way to help our community. So thanks a lot, Kim. Thanks everybody for joining. This session will be recorded and posted to our Rowing Canada website under the COVID-19 page. And as well, if you have any feedback from this session, please let us know. We'll be sending out a feedback survey and any ideas for future webinars. As we continue them along, it would be good to know what you need, and we'll do the best to provide those. So thank you, and thanks again, Kim. Have a good day, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.